I feel like using the same introduction that I used for the last 3 days with teachers and principals and educators in Rehovot, because we're starting a little bit about the same time, you know. And one of I generally said 3 things as a beginning. You know, one is the teachers, just like me, we were all at the end of our school year, so everybody was tired. So I just said, let's all agree that we're all, you know, tired, and you know, and this is hard. I said the second thing is that I hate being asked to give a presentation in the late afternoon, because we've all had lunch or we've had something to eat, and we're all, a second reason that most of us have a hard time kind of paying attention, you know, in the afternoon. And then I mentioned to the teachers that I'm also, I'm asking you to consider doing something new. And I said, at the end of the school year, when you've been asked to do so many new things, that it's hard to ask you to do one more, to think about doing one more new thing. And so, but it was, so I think it took away a little bit of what they came in with, some fears and some anxiety, you know, about the day. And then we went through the presentation that I'm going to show, that I'm going to review with you right now. And then we had them actually carry out the exercises. So they actually did work. So they did CSI. They did actually invent lessons that would apply. And so everybody left having said, you know, wow, I can do this. This is not that hard. But I'll start basically saying that, I'm going to run these slides through here. I didn't start with the idea of inventing this particular program. I started off because I was interested in looking at public welfare and the effects as America was introducing public welfare. It was going to be putting a lot of the your poverty or your low income families are mostly 2-parent families. And you have a growing number of single parent families. But in America, the highest proportion of children in poverty are living in 1-parent families. So we were about, in the mid-1990s, about to make a fairly significant change where we were going to require mothers who were largely at home to basically move into the labor force. And so that was going to leave children without a parent at home. And the concern was, what would the effects be on children in schools? And so I conducted a small study of 44,000 of them. I tracked 44,000 children and their mothers over time to see, as welfare came in and as they became employed or became unemployed and went back and forth in the labor market, what happened to their children. Now, these are not low-income families. The 44,000 I tracked were the most low-income. They were the ones who were the most economically disadvantaged, okay? So in some of my data here, you'll see that I refer to low-income because these are the children whose parents' income allowed them to get what we call free and reduced lunch. That is, they could get subsidized meals as part of but that represents a much higher proportion of children than just those who are most poor, okay? So you could be low income and get that income. So two things came out of the data. One was that children from the low-income families, particularly poverty families, whose mothers went to work and made a successful transition in the labor force, did better in school. They performed better in school, and they stayed in school at higher rates. Their dropout rates were lower, significantly lower than for the mothers who did not go to work or the mothers who cycled into work. So that was a surprise. So something was happening with work that was engaging children, because when we learned that qualitatively, that what was happening was, as mothers moved into the labor force, they took the message back home, stay in school. school is important. It's valuable to stay in school. Whereas the mothers prior, almost all these mothers had been dropouts. So they had left school early, and therefore their own success in school was not that great. So now in the labor force, they realized that they needed those skills. And they wanted their children to have them. So that was one of the motivators. The second thing I learned in that big study was we were doing a pretty good job with the mothers, with the children who were in elementary school. Our preschool programs in our state were very, very robust, and our elementary programs were working pretty effectively. But when those children moved into middle school, things changed dramatically. The middle school and the middle school experience was not well understood by educators, by educational psychologists, and others. In fact, I used to be on the editorial board of the Journal of Early Adolescence, and we just don't know as much about learning in early adolescence as we know about learning in later adolescence or in elementary years. And so we really needed more information about what were the learning styles and how do we promote learning. Fortunately, there was a literature that was developing a lot in the late 90s and early 2000s that benefited this project, but we really needed to do something there. So I came back, I shared my concerns with educational leadership in our state and around the country. And I said, we have a real problem with middle school. And everybody said, yes, we have a real problem with middle school. That was, they agreed. Children were matriculating from an elementary school experience largely with one teacher to multiple teachers. Puberty was kicking in. Parents were pulling back, in many cases, from participating in schools. Schools became more expert-driven, and the pedagogy changed dramatically during that time. So, and the pedagogy changes dramatically in that time. So we needed to do something that was potentially effective. So the principals that I talked to, the superintendents of schools that I talked to in our districts, said, Dr. Orthner, we understand your interest in addressing the needs of your children. My children mean the poor children, okay? But they said, we can't afford what you're recommending after school programs and all these enrichment programs for these children to make them universal. So he said, if you can come up with something that's integrated into the school curriculum, something that can be added to the school curriculum and that involves our current staffing without having to add whole new programs, whole new structures. So what they wanted was something that that would meet the needs of the low-income children, the ones at risk, but would also essentially serve all children. Be a universal program, would advantage all kids, would be inexpensive, would be and effective. So what they were asking me was the dream. Give me something that's cheap, fast, and effective. Okay, and then we'll do it. And so and we started that back in the early to mid 2000s. And my funding initially came from early dropout prevention support and then foundations that were interested in at-risk children. But in both cases, I had to convince the funders that this is a universal intervention, but we're going to be able to see the effects on all children. So that's essentially how we got started, with this. One of the issues that we run into is the fact that the climate for learning today is so demanding because increasingly our policy leaders understand that our educational systems are not just childcare, and they're not just learning systems, but they are part of the economy. That the economic health of a society depends on the quality of its schools, because the products of our schools essentially make our help our students and and our adults essentially effective. Without good schools, we will lose the ability to compete in the world economy. And as I told the teachers this week, students who may be graduating from schools in Rehovot are not just competing with other people in that area, they're competing with people not just in Haifa and not just in Jerusalem, but they're competing with people in Berlin, in Beijing, and Tokyo, and London, and New York, and where I live, Raleigh, North Carolina. You know, so they compete against, we're all competing right now for knowledge, you know, for the best jobs. And so schools, we have to essentially incentivize our schools to think differently. In the past, we've done a pretty good job with that in the high school years. But as I learned in my research, what we find is that student success is often defined by how well they finish school, which means high school. But the reality is, in my country, students stay in or drop out of high school, but they psychologically decide to stay in or drop out in middle school. It's middle school when they begin to disengage. They either engage with school and see school as valuable, or they disengage. And I'll show you some data on that. And I've just recently been to Germany and Romania and England and other places. We all agree this is a problem. So it's not just an American problem, it's not just an Israeli problem. You know, we are losing too many of our children in early adolescence, as they're 11, 12, 13 years old. If they don't see school as relevant at that point, they leave. Blinder, an economist from Princeton, says, you know, we have to transform our educational systems to produce young people, adults who can actually work in the jobs that we will be having in the future. And I like what he says there. He says, the future may be determined by how we educate our children, and that may be more important than how much we do. So we tend to think a lot more about what we teach and how much we teach, but not how we teach. And so the issue of pedagogy, or how we teach, is really what is the heart of what we're talking about here with CSI, CareerStart Israel. I focused a lot in my presentations this week on the importance of relevance, because in America, we used to have the old, if any of you have ever studied or read about American education systems, we used to talk about the 3 R's, which are reading, writing, and arithmetic, okay? The new 3 R's that come from the Gates Foundation are rigor, relevance, and relationships. That is, we now know that if you want students to learn something, and not pass a test, okay? We can get people to pass tests. But if you want some people to learn something, you have to basically take into account how much you demand of them. Students are more likely to learn something if we put demands on them and we give them good material that they have to pay attention to and they have to work on. The more they work on it, the more likely they are to retain it. Secondly, we know that relationships are key. That is, the relationship and trusting relationship with the teacher is important. And secondly, the relationship with peers, because we now know that learning in groups is a whole lot more effective than learning by oneself. Okay, we can learn things by oneself, and we do that with a lot of online learning today. But the reality is, we're more likely to retain information if we work together. And frankly, having a group of teachers yesterday was fascinating. We did some exercises after we did this. We could have broken down the teachers. Now, yesterday we had, what, 70 teachers there? I mean, teachers and administrators. So, I mean, that's a big group. And these were all science teachers in 7th grade. We could have asked them to work individually. But by getting them to work together in groups and to share ideas and make things, come up with new ideas for curriculum and teaching in groups, they really became much more creative. And they solved the issues much quicker than if they had done it as a group of individuals. And the same thing's true with 12-year-olds in middle school. The part that's often missing is relevance. We really are, we haven't paid as much attention to the concept of relevance until recently. Now, I know that your department or ministry is now working on meaningful meaningful learning. And meaningful learning to me is, relevance is a key part of that. And so I think that we were able to really bring those two thoughts together, very effectively. And when I used this statement, I said, how many of you basically hear this from your students? Who really uses this information? And how will this help me down the road? I mean, come on, Mrs. Baram, how am I going to ever use this? I did use her name a lot. So, but that was and they all nodded their heads. They all said, yes, that's what I hear from my students. And if the teacher can't give some relevant examples about how they use it, how it can be used, students typically roll their eyes and then, essentially put their pencils down and stop, learning. So that's what I call career relevant instruction. We're trying to increase that. Basically, we talk about instructional relevance in terms of how important the content is it useful, and does it add interest to the application to the lesson. There's some really good theories out there now. This work was very much advantaged by both value expectancy theory, which Wigfield and Eccles started and lots of people have worked on, basically saying that, particularly in early adolescence, that students are more likely to learn something if it is something that they expect. They're more likely to value what they hear if they expect that there's going to be some future utility in that. And there's a lot of research showing that is true. And possible selves theory gets into identity issues. What happens in early adolescence is that children move from having an identity that essentially is reflexive from their parents and to some extent from their teacher, that kind of sole teacher in elementary school, and they're moving toward creating a sense of who they might be as they grow up. What is my possible self? And children who basically can align what they're learning to this notion of possible self are much more likely to retain what they're taught. And I just put some references down there in terms of what we see. Daphne Oyserman is actually an Israeli scholar who teaches at the University of Michigan, a psychologist, educational psychologist. She teaches actually in School of Social Work. She's kind of like me, education and social work. And her work is very influential in terms of looking at how learning is advantaged by helping students form, or as they're forming their notion of possible self, how that connection works there. Essentially, this is the model I used with the teachers, and I said most of what we've tried to engage our students with is the content of what's in our curriculum. That is, we teach students, we're supposed to teach students about a particular concept or a particular lesson that is part of content. So in 7th grade science, there's a series of lessons around, or content areas around energy and matter. And so that content is supposed to be, the teacher knows that, the student's supposed to come to know that. So that's the way we essentially transfer that knowledge. Now, the reality is, if we can give that information to the student in the context of something the student can see today in their life, then they're more likely to be able to learn it. And so we give them a context, and then they're more likely to understand that. The part that I'm adding with CareerStart is basically future context. That is, in the context of life outside the classroom, school, and career, what is it that also can add to that context so that the student is more likely to retain and understand, not just understand, but then retain, that information and use that information. So essentially, that's what I would call a full contextual model for learning. Now, one of the questions is this too early? Is middle school too early? I can see this in high school, but is this too early? These are data from about 4,000 middle school students at the beginning of 6th grade. In other words, they haven't yet heard anything about CareerStart. This is before CareerStart came in. This is asking them questions about kind of what they're thinking about at the beginning of this year. So this is September at the beginning of September in the beginning of 6th grade. Your middle school starts at the beginning of 7th grade. And ours is, these schools started in 6th grade. But you can see that a high proportion of these students are already beginning to project the connection between school and work, okay? I mean, these data are shocking to our teachers, okay? What I found particularly interesting is that the Ministry of Education has done a survey of your students here in Israel, which shows almost the exact same numbers. So you did a study last year that we learned about this over the last few days, which shows 82% of your students at the beginning of 7th grade are thinking around the same things. So essentially, when I show this in other countries too, almost all the teachers say, these are not my students. And your teachers basically say, even though the students are saying, 82% of your students are saying, I'm interested in this, 80% of your teachers are saying they're not interested in this, okay? Our teachers did the same thing. Students saying, this is what I hope for. Teachers saying they don't have any idea, what this is about. So trying to get that connection, close that gap between what students are excited about or potentially interested in. Excited may be too strong at this point. They're getting curious about, okay? And helping that curiosity gap close is kind of what we're attempting to do. And here again, the teachers philosophically think, these are again before they heard anything about CareerStart, the teachers also tend to think that this is a good idea. They just don't think they didn't think their students were ready for it, okay? So they had kind of the beliefs, but no strategy as to how to do it. Now this is the scariest chart I have to show you. These are data, roughly 4,000 students. These are longitudinal data on roughly 4,000 students. These data are from the beginning of 6th grade. These children are like 11 years old, all right? And then the spring at the end of 6th grade, end of 7th grade, and end of 8th grade. This is longitudinal data, not cross-sectional data. These data show that roughly, and the top line are low-income students, okay? So essentially, you can see that the low-income students are actually coming in to middle school with higher hope that school is going to be useful to them than even my children, your children, okay, the middle-income children. So roughly, over 80% of our kids, if you take all the kids, all the children, are starting 6th grade really thinking school is the best thing since sliced bread, okay? That it's really a good place to be, and I'm going to get all the good things from school that I want. Over the course of 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, they lose that. They become more discouraged, and they are less likely. And the children who see that school is not relevant really grows up too. I didn't show you the other side of that, which is the bad side. You know what I mean? This is just the optimum good side. So and when I show these data, wherever I go, including for the last 3 days with your teachers, they say yes. That's our situation too. We're losing them in school. Okay, so that's a challenge. So that's the CareerStart challenge. Is how do we keep that engagement high, over the course of middle school? So CareerStart in Israel basically doesn't require teachers to teach anything new. They love that. We're not saying here's a whole new curriculum you have to add to what you're already doing. You have to add a whole bunch of new topics. We also didn't say that they have to become career educators. Then they have to really, their job is now to not just teach science or English or Hebrew or Arabic. They now have to teach, engineering and everything else. Okay, they don't have to do that. So basically, we're linking the lessons to required course content, and we're only asking each teacher to do this 10 times per year. And this is 1 class period, maybe 2 class periods, 1 to 2 class periods per year. So it's a very small dose. The lessons are going to be developed by teachers. The teachers themselves will be hired to prepare these lessons. It's not experts. It's not Dennis Orthner. You don't want me to do that, trust me. You want good teachers to be doing something, because we want, in fact, in the lessons that we have in the United States, we actually allow the teachers to put their names on the lessons, so the teachers can see that other teachers are doing this. Teachers get a lot of credibility with other teachers. Sometimes experts don't, okay, when it comes to some of this. So, and we're basically going to have a consultant who will work with these teachers. So throughout the year, they'll get information about kind of what the labor market's like, you know, and a variety of things that will help them do it. Now, let me talk about my research evidence. One of the questions that comes up is, does this work? We started this now about 8 years ago, and we've been tracking 2 cohorts of about 4,000 students each for the last, 7 or 8 years. We have data on each of these cohorts back to 3rd grade. We know what their test scores were like for 3rd and 4th grade, as well as in 5th grade, so we know, how well they were doing. So we've been following, this group of kids. This is an RCT, a randomized control trial. So that means that we had 14 middle schools. We randomly assigned those 14 middle schools 7 to treatment, CareerStart, and 7 to control. I wish I could say that, when I asked the superintendent in this particular school district, I said, okay, for the next 5 years, no student gets to move to different schools, and no teacher gets to move. He just laughed at me, because over the course of this time, we got contamination. Students moved from control schools to treatment schools to control schools, and teachers moved around. Much more, I think, than your students, than happens in your schools. So we didn't control for that, but the reality is we just know that happened. We collected data from teachers. We knew which lessons which teachers taught. We also knew from the students what they heard. So we collected data from students and teachers to get a good measure of dosage. That is, what the dose of CareerStart really was. It's not that we don't trust teachers, but teachers, had to fill out a little form saying that I taught this lesson and things like that. We wanted to make sure from the students that they actually heard that lesson. So those are the things that we did. We also did a variety of student surveys. We got administrative data on all the students. EOG stands for end of grade scores from all the classes that they took and things like that. So this is a very rigorous study, all right? So this is not a mild study. One thing I didn't put in here that we used with the teachers, we had some slides that actually we call this a slow drip approach. And I had some pretty cute slides that I'm not showing you. But essentially what I mean by that was no one teacher was responsible for the change. In this study, the teachers who were asked to do this in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade were in math, science, social studies, and language, okay? So each student could have gotten as many as 4 teachers over 3 years, or 12 teachers doing it. So they could be in a situation where none of their 12 teachers offered them any career relevant instruction, okay? Or up to 12, and you'll see there's a lot of variation in that. Because even though teachers were in CareerStart treatment schools, not everybody did it, okay? And so that's why we became reliant on the students' reports as much more than the teachers' reports, on this. Basically, the model is we introduce the program. The teachers that introduce the program in treatment schools, not in the control schools. The teachers essentially provide the dose of lessons. If the lessons are offered, then we would see changes in student school engagement, and we would see changes in student academic achievement, okay? And we measured engagement with various psychosocial measures and behavior measures of engagement. Achievement was basically based on test scores that they had. Taking out the dosage measure, we basically, this is the most rigorous assessment, because essentially now we're looking at the experimental study. In the experimental study, we have CareerStart schools, and we have treatment schools, and we have control schools. In this, we got higher school engagement on all our measures on school engagement. Behavioral measures, emotional measures, cognitive measures of engagement. So all of those measures are more significant, and we have publications that Noya can pass out that, you know, there are a list of publications where we can find this data. On the test scores, we found, again, pretty strong effects for math and reading. And you can see the experimental analysis, the reading effect size is 0.46, and for math is 0.25. So we had a higher effect size, but we had more variation. We had more variation on the math side, on the reading side, excuse me. So we had pretty good effects on both. Now, if we use the dosage measure, what we had to, one question was, are teachers able to do this? And we found that, that students in CareerStart schools reported hearing more job and career examples than core teachers. One thing I said to the teachers yesterday is, I'm not so stupid to believe that you don't already do this. Okay? Many of those teachers already do some of this. Okay? They give examples from jobs and careers. What I'm trying to do is get more of you to do it, and more of you to do it consistently. Okay? Because some of this, we found in our control schools, some of this is already going on, because our students reported that they were hearing these kind of lessons. And when we confirmed it with their teachers, we found out the teachers were doing some of this. So, but in our CareerStart program, we were able to increase this dramatically. Also, we get very significant improvements in both school engagement and school valuing, two of our measures on school engagement, and we get higher academic achievement scores. Particularly strong reading effect size is 0.77. So that was good. So let's look at this chart again. Remember this one? Go to the end of the year. So take a look at the end of the year, and maybe look at the lines at the end of the year. What you see at the end of the year is that fewer than 60% of the students are still highly engaged at the end of the year. Okay? Now, next chart. Just think about that. This is what happens with CareerStart dosage. So the average line across there is a little below 60%. What you see is that if a student is unlucky enough to have none of their teachers over 3 years giving them career-relevant instructions, the chances are that they will be highly engaged is only about 1 in 3. Okay? I mean, you know, you're down to 30-some% of students. The more that they hear these lessons from their teachers, the more likely they're higher engaged. If they were lucky enough to have almost all their teachers, 11 to 12 of their teachers, giving career instructions, their engagement is over 80%. Okay? I teach some statistics. I just love to show this chart, because this is my beautiful regression line that I'd love to be able to replicate, you know, without having to do having to log it or do other kinds of fancy statistics to make it work. But it's basically a nice linear line. Now, that's not the only thing that happens. Let's see. Here you see attendance. This is unexcused absences. And you can see that for black students and Hispanic students, which are our minority students, that the more teachers they have that give career-relevant instruction, the fewer unexcused absences that they have. Okay? So they're more likely to show up in school when they are hearing more examples that help them see the relevance of their education. This is suspension rates, you know, kids who get into trouble. In school and out of school suspension rates. Again, similar kind of drop. The drops go down, and you can see it for both the free and reduced lunch kit. ISS is in-school suspension, OSS is out-of-school suspension. So in and out-of-school suspension rates drop, again, for low-income children dramatically when we get these, when they use these, when they hear these. Now, what happens when they leave high school? No more CareerStart. Now we find in 9th and 10th grade that their biology scores are better, Their English 1 end of grade test scores are better, and their algebra grades go up as a result of this. And they have more credits towards graduation. And the more teachers that gave them instruction, the more likely the effects are positive. So here's a couple of comments from students. You can look at those. My favorite one is the top one where it says, I'd like it if they do a bit more. I think these were qualitative interviews and focus groups we did with students at the end of 7th grade. With the teachers, again, the teachers, and these are some of the teachers at the end of 7th grade who said these kind of questions. The kids reacted positively. They were more serious about learning. They seemed to like showing them the connection, and that was helpful. And then basically just a summary, teachers do not seem to have much difficulty doing it, which is nice. When Noya came over last year to visit the schools that we were doing this research in, it was interesting that most of the teachers no longer use the online lessons. We have over 140 online lessons that teachers have developed that fit each subject by each curriculum in online. But now the teachers just do it. I mean, they've become so accustomed to doing it that it's now part of just what they do. They have kept, the school system has kept up the measure of the students. The students get asked at the end of the school year, how often did your science teacher, separate question, science, social studies, language arts, math teacher, give you examples from jobs and careers as part of their instruction, okay? And so the motivation in part is they want their students to report that they did it. But the performance standards, each teacher now gets evaluated by their supervisors, by their principals, on how much they're doing. So the principals are responsible for going in and observing the classrooms to see that this is happening. Even more important, the new state standards now have this in. So what happened was as an experiment is now become institutionalized. It's now what's done. So basically teachers can do it, middle school students benefit from it, the benefits continue even into high school. The costs are cheap because you basically already have the structure in place to do it. We just provided some incentives to get it going. And the highest impacts were basically found from the schools that were most likely to implement. That is my spiel. It's after this, just so you know, what we did the last 3 days with 170 teachers this was a crowded room. In most cases. I mean, it was a very packed room. And the teachers came in, I think Noya and I, and if Shlomi were here, would say that they came in a little tired, and when I finished the presentation, and they were hopeful, but when I finished the presentation, they really said, oh, can I really do this? Okay, this seems kind of hard. Can I really do this? So we asked them to answer 3 questions, and we broke them into groups to work on those questions. The first question is easy. Take one topic or lesson that you're required to teach in your 7th grade class. Okay, just pick something that you believe is really important for your students to know, and something you cover in only 1 or 2 days. Okay, just discuss that. Pick a one. Secondly, what jobs or careers would be potentially linked to that topic? Is there anything that people in jobs and careers what jobs and careers are out there where knowing that topic is helpful, okay, would be helpful. And then third, develop a one-class outline of what a teacher could do to teach the topic or lesson and throw in some examples of how how different careers would do it. They then took a break, and then they came back in, and they did their work for about an hour. And in 1 hour, these groups of generally 8 to 10 people, groups of 8 to 10, were amazing. There was so much energy. It was hard to hear in the room because they were talking so actively. And by the end of the time, at the end of that hour, we gave them another short break, and they came back and they gave a presentation on their idea. And they were wonderful. I mean, and they were wonderful. And the comments they gave at the end were, I can't believe how easy this was. We can do this. This is not hard. And you know, and so they left thinking, this is something I can do next year. And they said, what will you give us to help us, you know, with this? And we said, essentially, we're going to, I think the idea was, we're going to develop, we meaning teachers will be hired, not we. Some of you will be hired to develop 3 lessons over the summer, so that you have, and when you start the school year, you have 3 lessons to begin with. Then they'll have 2 more by the end of the semester and 5 more by the end of the year. But these will be short and easy to implement, because you teachers here, one of you, or 2 of you are going to be selected to help write this, and we'll pay you to do that. So that's essentially the story that we left them with. Okay? I'll sit down. Any thoughts, comments, complaints, confessions?
Have you tried to implement that